This video is about recognizing and avoiding the logical fallacy known as begging the question. Begging the question is assuming the conclusion in your argument. It's a form of circular argument. The same premise is in the beginning and the end of the argument. Some of them are just statements from authority that we take for granted, or maybe something we tell ourselves when we haven't thought about the issue from every angle. Begging the question is really common. I've certainly made some of the arguments I'm going to present here as examples. Have you? I'm Chris, and this is what had to be said. Before we start, though, I'd like to tell you all about our new sponsor. As I'm sure you've heard already, I've recently become the official spokesperson for Gwyneth Paltrow's company, Dupe. And I'm here today to tell you all about their newest dietary supplements. All you have to do is take all these pills in one day, drink a glass of water, sleep well, and overnight they'll have cured cancer, erectile dysfunction, and skepticism. Who needs health care anymore? Don't be duped by other scientifically questionable supplement dealers. Get your supplements from Dupe. Imagine I said Usain Bolt is the fastest person in the world. If you wanted to undermine that argument, you could find some flaws, at least if you don't mind being called a smartass, and certainly in my case that's never been something I've worried about. There are a couple of big assumptions behind the word fastest. First, he's the fastest ever recorded. Doesn't necessarily make him the fastest in the world. Second, is it fair to assume the 100 meters is the proper measure of the fastest person? What about the fastest marathon runner? Or who says we're even talking about running? What about the fastest swimmer? Or triathlete? What about people in cars and planes who've broken the sound barrier? Sometimes what about and who says are your best weapons for demolishing an argument or just being annoying. Alright, let's get political. Imagine I said Trump is the worst president the US has ever had, because of all the terrible things he's done. Well, what criteria define worst president? Terrible from whose point of view? It's fine to air your opinion, but in a case like this, it could just as easily be turned against you. Oh yeah, well, who's better? That guy? Well, that guy did this, that, and the other, and by my criteria, those things are terrible, so that makes him the worst. And there's no way for either of you to be right. Unless you're new to this channel, in which case, hello, you know that I talk about big issues and propose big changes. If you're the same, you may have heard someone say what you want is unrealistic, or idealistic, same thing to them. Any kind of radical proposal or solution gets called unrealistic. Never gonna happen. It was unrealistic to think we could fly, or breathe underwater, or communicate with each other on the other side of the world. If you get enough people working on something, it becomes realistic. I just think our priorities are wrong. We spend trillions on war and prisons and advertising and flying rich people to space when there's so much more we could be doing. But it's unrealistic, so don't even try. That's the first argument I usually hear that begs the question. The next one depends what we're talking about. In this video, I want to focus on systems of power like I usually do. I spend a lot of time arguing against the existence of some social institutions, and one of the most common counter-arguments I hear goes something like, we only have so-and-so because of the thing that I'm arguing against. For example, you only have the cool technology you have because of capitalism, you only have your freedom because of the state, the way it is, and we only have science or healthcare or something because of class society. Yes, I've heard that argument. These arguments beg the question. First, we have to assume the thing in question, whatever thing they're saying we're lucky we have, is a good thing. And of course, that's a whole argument in itself. Is it actually a good thing, or does that beg the question too? A lot of the things that you could point out as good things, say this, are more like necessary things to be able to live in modern society. Of course you have a bed. You have to sleep so you can work. Of course you have running water. You have to take a shower so you can go to work. Of course you have a laptop. You might have to use it for work. See, we live in a class society. A ruling class is like a parasite, feeding off your labor. If it wants to continue to exist, it needs a host with the latest technology. What's more, due to the oppressive nature of these systems, the good things might cause bad things, like putting you under constant surveillance, destroying the environment, or working people like slaves. Another way these arguments beg the question is they assume we only have the good things because of how history has panned out. I mean, we know humans used to be hunter-gatherers, but some began to settle 10,000 years ago, give or take a few millennia. At some point after that, a group of people subdued and subordinated another larger group of people and forced those people to work for them. This new form of class society formed the basis of what we call civilization and evolved into what we now call the state. Over the past 5,000 years, states have grown from their origins in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China to spread all over the surface of the globe and even out into space, in case you were thinking of leaving. Most of us have lived under a state society or class society our whole lives. So naturally, we find it hard to understand the effects of the systems we live under, and living without them would feel like another planet. But history didn't have to go this way. The argument that we're better off because of the way history has gone and what we have begs the question. What if no states had emerged? What if instead of being enslaved, the people had been prepared and repelled anyone who tried to become their masters? A lot of these proto-states from thousands of years ago were overthrown by their subjects. Well, what if all of them had been? And we had remained vigilant ever since? Would life have been worse than now? What if we had shared everything fairly back then, so everyone had enough to eat and so on? After all, people used to do that. That's how we survived as a species. It's only in the past few thousand years that a few people have taken the fruit of people's labor for themselves and lived off it. What if we had just shared stuff? With your needs met, you can pursue science or art or whatever you like. So who's to say we wouldn't have all the stuff we have now that's actually beneficial and way fewer of the things that hurt us? You can only make that argument one way or another by engaging in counterfactual history. You know, what if this or that had happened? How would things have been different? That can be fun, but you can't use it to make a logical argument about the way things would be today, because it would beg the question. Likewise, whatever I say about capitalism, someone tells me capitalism is the reason for all the good things. Problem is, just because we live under a capitalist system doesn't mean the only way or the best way to make something is the capitalist mode of production. Capitalism forces billions of people to work. Is it so inconceivable that billions of people can come up with and mass produce some useful stuff? But no one making the argument for capitalism ever acknowledges that. What if those people had been working towards solving social problems, rather than doing whatever makes more money for people who already have money?
We help those who already have the means to help themselves.
Another common argument you hear about capitalism is certain people simply deserve more, whether because they work harder or because they make the decisions or take risks with their money or something, so they deserve more money. And since money is power, power over people. But why? Working harder should necessarily translate to more money than other people get. You need to justify that premise to make it a logical argument. Why do they deserve more? Making the important decisions requires some kind of knowledge people making less money could never acquire. People with money who take a risk somehow deserve more than employees who are forced by their financial situation to sign contracts making them take risks. All these arguments beg the question, which is presumably why economists work so hard coming up with charts and graphs just to justify them. But it's kind of funny how people work how people will defend great concentrations of wealth, but never argue poor people deserve more for all the hard work they do and all the risks they take. Let's look at some other aspects of the system, shall we? The legal system decides right from wrong, but only because we assume that's its function. Most people assume what constitutions and laws say is morally correct, the arbiters of right and wrong. So of course it's morally wrong to do that. That's against the law. Or the way people put it, the law is the law. Yeah, but that doesn't justify the moral authority the law claims, nor the violence that goes into enforcing it. So you can drink as much alcohol, smoke as much cigarettes as you want, but don't ever try psychedelics. They're against the law. They're evil. The state said so. Saying a person is guilty because the judge said he's guilty assumes guilt is properly decided by a judge. We know judges can be wrong or even malicious. We know people who didn't commit the crime have gone to jail and even got the electric chair before. And yet the authority of the state and all its agents is assumed without having to do anything to earn it. I get told we need the legal system to guard our freedom and rights from criminals because people love to say things that beg the question. If someone says that, it's likely they've never considered a more peaceful and less oppressive form of justice. In other words, things have to be this way because I haven't thought of another way. Criminals are defined by crime, and crime is defined by the law, and the law is the monopoly of the state. You didn't write the laws. They weren't made for you. Why do you insist other people follow them? What's your logic? I don't care about criminals. Everybody breaks the law. If you're opposed to violence, great, me too. But the law doesn't stop violence. It doesn't even prohibit it. The law is violence. It's politicians threatening you for violating their rules. It's police claiming the right to use whatever kind of violence on you they deem necessary. It's the courts claiming the right to decide what will happen to you. It's the prisons claiming the right to keep you in a cage. Just because someone committed a crime does not mean they should be punished. To say the state's violence is the correct violence begs the question. Does the law prevent violence or reduce the total amount of violence? We don't know. You could argue it does, but only by begging the question. However, we can see cases where decriminalization of something, like drugs or sex work, has led to a marked decrease in violence from both mafia and the state. We know that because studies have shown clearly that one country compared over time experiences less violence when it legalizes drugs or sex work. Look up studies on Portugal if you're interested. But we also know because it happens that way everywhere, every time those things are legalized. Violence and mafia control went down after alcohol prohibition ended in the US and Canada. It went down when just cannabis was legalized in places like Colorado. It's actually a really easy way to reduce violence in prison populations and an easy argument to make. It also undermines the claim that the law or the state itself reduces violence, since it could easily do so, but chooses instead to escalate it, introducing violence into peaceful human activities like getting high or having sex. I hear people say of the government or the media things like, they wouldn't say that if it weren't true, or they wouldn't be able to get away with that, or the truth must come out somehow, one day, eventually. And I look at them and wonder what they learned in history class. I hear people say, or at least reason tacitly, if my country is at war with them, they must be bad people, and I want my country to win. After all, they assume. If something can be argued to be good for my country, whatever they think that means it's somehow good for me, too. Whereas if my country has enemies, so do I. If only they questioned the idea of their country, they might start to see how poor their reasoning was. The same would go for their insistence there be a limit on how many people enter their sacred landmass that foreigners aren't allowed to touch. These are typical nationalist beliefs. Nationalism creates the idea of a country and tints it a rosy hue, legitimizing all the institutions associated with the nation in the mind of the nationalist. There are arguments for just about everything that beg the question. I made a whole video exposing the lie that IQ measures intelligence. We believe that because we assume IQ is a measure of intelligence and define intelligence as high IQ. Or if you argue against hitting a child, because of the big pile of studies saying it's really bad for them, people will say, hey, I got beaten as a child and look how great I turned out. Well, wouldn't it make just as much sense to say, I got beaten as a child and look how much better I could have turned out? I think that's enough examples for me for today. Do you hear any arguments that beg the question? Or that commit some other common logical fallacy? Let me know down there. See you next week.